Now in front of me I have the L26 crank from the 260, and back here we have an L28 crank from some parts we bought on Craigslist, just from someone local. Now it looks like we got really lucky. I just cleaned off this crank and it actually looks like it was, the journals were polished already. Hopefully that's the case. What we're going to do now is I'm going to measure all the journals, the diameter of journals, with a micrometer, and we'll compare that with, we have a list of crankshaft specs to make sure that they are within factory spec. This way we just use standard bearings. We just can order standard bearings next week. If they're undersized, we'll just have to get oversized bearings, for our engine. Now again, Nissan supply these engines with forged crankshafts, as opposed to cast cranks like most of the domestic small block engines that I'm used to. They all came with, cast cranks. Now the easiest way, if you're looking for a crank to tell if it's forged or cast, is just to look at the joining marks. Now look over here, you can see this very broad area where the metal was forged and it was cut off when the crank was machined. Now in a cast crank, instead of this very broad area over here, you would have that thin line like we had on the engine block, which is the casting mating surfaces where the two parts of the molds were put together, and just again, it would be a very fine line. So these are forged. Now besides being forged, another really nice detail on these Nissan cranks are these oil feed holes. Now all of these holes are actually from the factory. They're very nicely chamfered. Again, I'm used to domestic engines where would be no chamfer. You'd have to go in with a die grinder or with a file and just kind of ease over this surface on the oil feed holes. But again, Nissan has provided some very generous chamfers. So the only thing we're going to really do with this crank is clean it as best we can. Of course, we'll use our little brushes and we'll go in and we will clean out all the holes, wipe away as much grime as we can. Now I'm not going to knock out these plugs. I know in the books they say take out the plugs, but they make it look like they're very simple plugs like you would use on like a freeze plug. But these are actually slugs. They're metal slugs. So for this project, I'm not going to remove them. Now this L26 crank, it has a lot of the wear and tear you would expect. So let's just do a couple of things that we would typically do for just a simple, no budget stock rebuild. Now, if your journals look a little rough and you want to try polishing them at home, you can take a piece of emery cloth and some string, and with a little bit of lubrication, just wrap it around the journal, and then taking a piece of string, just kind of wrap it in place. Now, if you're really inclined to do this, you could do this. I know if my journals were looking really rough or had scratches in them, I would really be inclined simply to take it to a machine shop and have them polish it or cut and polish the journals, depending on whatever the crank needed. But again, if you're inclined, you can try this with sandpaper, lubricant, and a piece of string. Now, if your crank does not have generous chamfers like these Nissan cranks, you could use a small round file or a Dremel tool. And you simply, get into that oil feed passage and start breaking the edge. Now, of course, with something like a Dremel tool, it'll be a lot easier to break that edge. Just be extremely careful with your journal surfaces. Now, once you chamfer that hole, make sure you get some emery cloth to remove any high spots or burrs. Now, if our factory cranks didn't have such generous chamfers on the oil feed holes, I was thinking about making a modification and using a die grinder with carbide burr. I was thinking of cutting a relief on the trailing edge of these oil feed holes. So of course the crank's going this way. This side will be the leading edge as the trailing edge. And I would secure the crank and then find the center of the journal and then just cut in a little depression along that, just to help leave as much oil on that bearing surface as possible. And of course, whenever doing anything like this, eyewear is mandatory. Eye protection is mandatory. So I believe the theory of this is to get as much oil, or have like a micro reservoir of oil on our bearing surfaces as possible, while minimizing any loss of journal surface. And this actually came out really nice. I may actually do it to all the oil feed holes on our L28 crank.